December 7, 1941, the Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor propels the United States into the Second World War. On the west coast of America, a sudden expansion of naval activity begins in preparation for what will become the greatest seaborne campaign in history. In the thriving community of Long Beach, California, a naval station called Roosevelt Base, in honor of the nation's wartime president, is rushed to completion. Less than a year later, a neighboring shipyard is also activated. Its original designation is the U.S. Naval Dry Docks, Terminal Island. At their peak, they served as one of the linchpins of the U.S. Navy on the West Coast, providing a port and repair facilities for a major portion of the Pacific Fleet. In peace and war, these facilities help to bolster the defense of a nation and to exert a singular influence on the course of countless individual lives. It is the biggest of stories made up of the smallest of pieces, a vast mosaic of hopes, dreams, and joys, of loves, losses, and memories, of people that met, mingled, and were forever changed by the Roosevelt Base and the Long Beach Naval Shipyard. The origins of the Long Beach naval bases stretch back well before World War II. Possessing a broad area for anchorage and easy access to the sea, the Long Beach and Los Angeles beachfront were used by visiting ships as early as the 1540s, when Spanish explorer Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo first came to the region. Trade in the harbor area expanded in the 1820s when Mexico won its independence from Spain, and the anchorage was opened to use by foreign ships. An influx of American entrepreneurs began developing the San Pedro landing into a hub of local transportation. In the years after 1880, various improvements, such as wharves and breakwaters, were constructed in an effort to enhance the harbor's prospects as a deep-water port and capture more international trade, particularly to Asia. In 1905, a firm based in Long Beach called the Los Angeles Dock and Terminal Company purchased 800 acres of mudflats next to Los Angeles Harbor, with the goal of developing a harbor in Long Beach. Its first major tenant, the Craig Shipbuilding Company, arrived in 1907. But the event that put Long Beach on the map for military purposes occurred in 1908, when the U.S. Navy chose Long Beach Harbor as a domestic stop for President Teddy Roosevelt's Great White Fleet during its round-the-world cruise. The Navy's presence expanded in 1919, when President Woodrow Wilson chose to berth the newly formed U.S. Pacific Fleet in San Pedro Bay for 7 months of the year. The recent completion of a 2-mile-long breakwater allowing for over 600 acres of anchorage at 40 feet of depth, good year-round weather for operations and maneuvers, the availability of shop and repair facilities, the large local supply of fuel oil, and the proximity of excellent gunnery ranges at Santa Rosa and San Clemente Islands made the area a perfect choice. On March 10, 1933, that choice proved fortuitous for another reason, when fate compelled the Navy to take on a different role, that of Angel of Mercy. At 5:54 p.m. on that day, the Great Long Beach earthquake struck, killing 54, injuring over 1,000, and leaving 140,000 without shelter. Within 15 minutes of the disaster, Admiral R.H. Lee, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, which was then anchored offshore, offered help to the beleaguered community. More than 2,000 naval personnel were detailed to guard damaged property, render first aid, do rescue work, and land emergency provisions. The Navy also landed medical supplies and ship's doctors to assist the city's damaged and hard-pressed hospitals in caring for the flood of injured. Acts like this helped solidify the Navy's presence in Long Beach, forging a bond with the community that was destined to last for over half a century. The outbreak of World War II in September 1939 began a process that would see the Navy's presence mushroom even further. A giant step in this evolution took place when Congress enacted a bill to establish a two-ocean navy after the fall of France in June of 1940. This plan mandated a 70% increase in Navy forces and included over $300 million for the construction of shore establishments, a significant portion of which were to be built on the West Coast. A central feature of these new shore facilities were huge dry docks that would be large enough to accommodate the bigger battleships and aircraft carriers the Navy then had on the drawing board. The so-called super docks would need to be over 1,000 feet long and 150 feet wide. In September of 1940, the Navy decided to build one of the first of these massive structures at Terminal Island on San Pedro Bay. They also decided to establish a naval base adjacent to this facility at around the same time. On December 18, 1940, the city of Long Beach sold the Navy 104 acres of land on which to build the two establishments for the grand sum of $1. And in January 1941, construction began in earnest on what would soon become Roosevelt Base. By this time, a company called Allied Engineers Incorporated, whose members included renowned architect Paul R. Williams, had been hard at work for months on a plan for the naval base.
The Long Beach Naval Base is a marvelous example of planning. There is an overall concept which is beautifully executed, and when you look at an aerial plan of the base, you see that every component of it was carefully put in place. The administration building is the key element, and the other buildings are grouped and arranged in a way that there are vistas that underscore their significance, tie everything together.
The designers who were responsible for this remarkable plan were Adrian Wilson and Paul Revere Williams. Nationally known associate architect Paul Williams had built his reputation designing scores of luxury residences for clients in business and the world of entertainment. He was the first African-American member of the prestigious American Institute of Architects and the first to be elected a fellow of the organization. His high level of achievement was all the more remarkable because it took place during a time in American history when discrimination against blacks was widespread.
People did not perceive architecture as a field appropriate for African Americans. And yet, despite all of the discouragements that he received from his teachers in high school, he decided to vindicate all of his skills, to learn everything that he could and be the best architect that he could possibly be.
Interestingly, it was the intimate feel and tasteful execution of his residential designs that drew Williams into the seemingly unrelated field of commercial architecture.
For example, the Litton Industries building in Beverly Hills, the person who commissioned the building and hired Paul Williams saw some of his residential designs and just fell under the spell of them because they were just so carefully conceived and beautifully done, that he wanted an office building to reflect the nicest qualities of a residential building. So I think those commissions and other commissions where people wanted a residential character for a commercial building helped to push him into commercial architecture.
Like many architects of the period, Williams was a skilled practitioner of the so-called international style for his public buildings.
The international style was an effort by architectural theorists in the early 20th century to create a style of architecture that would truly reflect the 20th century. The advances in technology, it would be forward-looking, it would fully embrace the industrial age and get rid of historical references, ornamentation, decorative detail, and the like.
Williams collaborated with Adrian Wilson on a number of projects besides the Roosevelt Base, both during and after the war. These included the Pueblo del Rio Defense Housing Complex in Vernon, California, the Los Angeles County USC Medical Center, and the Los Angeles County Courthouse. Their strong sense of teamwork is clearly reflected in the design of the Long Beach facility.
They worked together to develop the overall concept of the base and to do the planning. Paul Williams probably worked with any landscape architecture staff in doing the landscape planning for the base, which is a very good example of regional influenced landscape design. And Paul Williams probably had a larger role in thinking out some of the smaller details of how to do the interiors of the buildings, because that's really where he excelled, is giving things kind of a homier touch to make things that were otherwise cold and large, smaller scaled and warm to the people using those spaces.
This feeling of warmth and intimacy was a direct result of Williams' masterful touch with residential designs and distinguished the Roosevelt base from the other military facilities that were built during this time. Indeed, in many ways, it was more suggestive of a college campus than a military base.
It was a departure, and in fact, the design was thought so significant by the design profession that there was an article which appeared in the 1944 Architectural Record.
The centerpiece of the base was the administration building with its imposing clock tower. In it are reflected all the creative elements that Williams brought to the design of the base as a whole.
My favorite building is the administration building because of that tower and how it has kind of a welcoming arm layout in terms of the floor plan. And you go into the lobby, you have a beautiful mosaic tile floor that has kind of a navy theme to it. And all of the elements in the design are very functional, but when you put all of them together, they create a very attractive whole. Finally, the thing that is really remarkable and compelling about the design is how you can take a very functionally designed building in the spirit of the international style without any decorative elements whatsoever really on the outsides, and use the massing of the building and the details of the windows and the doors and some of the other architectural elements, the siding of the buildings and the landscaping to create something truly memorable.
But the Roosevelt base is memorable for other reasons as well, for beneath its refined and attractive surface was a deeper and more immediate purpose: to serve as a springboard for U.S. naval forces that were then waging the most desperate oceanic struggle in the nation's history. When the United States was catapulted into World War II in December 1941, work on the naval facilities in Long Beach was already well underway. On September 1st, 1942, the Roosevelt base was declared operational. It wasn't long before the most important component of the installations began to arrive: the people who served there. Among the first of these was a young ensign named Richard Cords.
I was the 13th officer assigned to this base when the base was brand new. I came in March of 1943, and I was on the base for 22 months, and then finally shipped out to the South Pacific on an attack transport, the APA-28, the Charles Carroll. And while my tenure was here on this base, I had a whole raft of different positions. I started out as a ship's secretary, and that meant taking care of all of the mail that came into the base, including the classified matter. And the classified matter had to go to the captain each morning. And I would take it in the captain's office, and his civilian secretary was this young lady right here, or then Virginia Regan. And sometimes the captain would be busy on the telephone or otherwise, and I'd have to sit out there and talk to his secretary. So I just talked too long, I guess. And we ended up getting married a year or so later, and we've been married ever since.
The story of the Cords mirrors that of countless other couples who met and began their lives together while serving on the bases. It also underscores the fact that the Long Beach facilities were the workplace for thousands of civilian personnel, men and women of all races and creeds, many of whom hailed from the community of Long Beach itself.
I am a native of Long Beach, grew up and raised in Long Beach, and I was in college when the war broke out, and I came home and applied for a job as a civil secretary at the base here, and was assigned to be secretary to the aide to the commandant of the base, Captain Frank Huntoon. And so that's how I met my husband.
Cords worked in the administration building.
Well, the ad building was the hub of this whole base. And people walking around today don't realize the size and the utility of this base. There were literally thousands of sailors and officers aboard this base, and it was a hub of activity.
The base's original purpose had been to provide logistic support to the Pacific Fleet. But when the fleet was moved to Pearl Harbor in the late 1930s, this role became impossible. So shortly after the war began, Roosevelt Base became a personnel center for the training and conditioning of officers and men, and was also designated as the Small Craft Training Center for the Pacific Fleet. Among the most important functions of the base in this role was to serve as a location for the testing and training of the anti-submarine ships and personnel that protected the American fleet in the Pacific.
Every ship that had anything to do with anti-submarine warfare that was manufactured up and down the coast of California, Oregon, and Washington came through this base for shakedown. In other words, preparing it for sea duty. And they did not go out to sea or overseas at all until they passed a rigid 2 weeks test here. It included every phase of shipboard activity: communications, navigations, engine room, seamanship, just everything that you can think of that is entailed in shipboard life, and particularly in wartime.
Like many other naval personnel who served on the base, Richard Cords eventually followed these ships into combat. Fortunately, Ensign Cords survived his time in the eye of the storm. Others who served on the base weren't so lucky.
There were a number of instances where fellows and ships would leave, and that's the last you'd see of them. And so a lot of people in that atmosphere, while you try to make as much pleasure and fun out of your existence as you can. And so we had a lot of parties and tried to be happy and gay and cheerful and try to keep morale up. They had a show just about every month here of some big band, or Bob Hope with his regular USO show came one time.
Despite the outward sense of gaiety, however, everyone knew the importance of their work on the base.
There was an urgency about it. There was an anxiety, kind of an undercurrent. You didn't know really what was going to happen, but you had to go on and maintain the jobs that you were doing and for the country. But there was tremendous feeling of support and patriotism for the country.
This same sense of importance infused the workers and personnel at the shipyard, whose job was to repair battle-damaged vessels and return them to combat as quickly as possible. The first of these ships was the USS Kendrick, which was dry docked in September 1942. At this time, the Navy was planning to have the dry docks and repair facilities operate as a sub-function of the Roosevelt base. Since the yard was an industrial facility with a large component of civilian workers, the Navy separated it from the direct military activities of Roosevelt Base. And on February 25, 1943, the U.S. Naval Dry Docks Roosevelt Base Terminal Island was commissioned as a separate command. Like the base itself, its facilities were impressive. The yard's Morrell Dry Dock had a 56 million gallon capacity, making it the largest south of Puget Sound. It could accommodate the biggest battleships and aircraft carriers in the U.S. fleet. Unique techniques used in the construction of this dock helped Navy engineers and contractors cut dry dock building times from an average of 4 to 5 years to 17 months. By September 1943, workers had completed 2 more huge dry docks, along with 3 piers, a woodworking shop, cafeteria, and other support facilities. Other notable features were a temporary pontoon bridge to connect Long Beach and Terminal Island, and a 10,000-foot mole to protect the naval base and dry docks. The yard's workforce was also among the largest at any naval facility, peaking at an all-time high of 16,091 in August of 1945. The work done at the shipyard was instrumental in keeping the U.S. fleet in peak condition throughout the desperate fighting of the Pacific Campaign. Over the course of the war, it repaired and refurbished a staggering 685 ships, 300 of which required major overhauls. Together with Roosevelt Base, the U.S. Naval Dry Docks Terminal Island made a significant contribution to the Allied victory. As the war drew to a close, they prepared to face a new chapter in their eventful history. The importance of Roosevelt Base and the U.S. Naval Dry Docks Terminal Island didn't end when the war was finally won. In fact, the cessation of hostilities actually caused a temporary increase in the activity in Long Beach, as ships that had been stationed at forward bases in the Pacific came home for refit and repair. Segments of the Pacific Fleet which had made Long Beach their home port prior to the war also returned, and it birthed the Long Beach Group of the Pacific Reserve Fleet, military sea transportation service ships, and ships of the Service Squadron. Jim Gill, who rose from a busboy to become the manager of the Officers Club, recalls those heady days.
After World War II, it didn't affect the club too much. In fact, the business was really booming because when the ships came in after the war, they really celebrated. Everybody's happy the war was over, happy to be back.
But for the people at the base, it wasn't all celebration. Much work had to be done. 1946 was a record year, with the shipyard servicing a total of 285 naval vessels. The yard accomplished these numbers with a workforce 30% lower than during the war. Ironically, a crucial piece of equipment that helped repair the war damage was a gigantic floating crane that had been captured from the Germans. Nicknamed Herman the German, it was 374 feet tall, with a normal lifting capacity of over 380 hundred tons, making it the largest self-propelled floating crane in the world. Working with the dry docks, it was instrumental in helping to repair scores of ships. It went on to serve for nearly half a century, until the time the bases closed, lifting everything from the huge guns of a battleship to Howard Hughes's giant flying boat, the Spruce Goose. By the beginning of 1948, the post-war activity at Long Beach was nearly complete, and the bases began to look forward to a more permanent peacetime status within the Navy. This new role soon led to new names. In a large official ceremony on March 2, 1948, they were officially redesignated the Long Beach Naval Shipyard and the Long Beach Naval Station.
The Naval Station has been a part of my life for more than 50 years. From a young girl, actually through adulthood. My mother worked here on the station, and she worked as a decoder. It had to do with, as the ships came into port, the numbers on the ships were transcribed and sent elsewhere, and it was just a way of keeping track of the ships in the Navy and where they were at any given time.
Many who worked on the naval station during these years remember them as some of the finest of their lives. A period when all the amenities that had been painstakingly included in the design by Paul Williams made the base a focus not only of professional activity, but family life as well. Among these were Lieutenant Junior Grade Frank Black and his wife Zetta.
Tables. The best years here were in 1946 through 48, 49, 50, along in that era, when started by being here on Admiral Welch's staff, and after I got out of the Navy, I was still in the Naval Reserve, and we brought our kids over here and enjoyed all the facilities like the tennis courts, the swimming pool, and all the chances to eat food here and party with friends.
Like many others, Frank and Zetta Black were regular visitors to the Officers Club and share fond memories of the times they spent there.
This was a dining room and the dance floors over here behind us.
It was a beautiful place, and we loved to dance here. We even danced out on the patio.
We played the slot machines.
He hit the jackpot. We called them one-arm bandits. and I had on a lace dress, and I pulled it up, filled it with quarters, and some of the other women that were with us were picking up quarters in their skirts too.
Over the years, the Officer Club, we served there as a place for the recreation, for food. We catered weddings, anniversaries, birthdays. A lot of the officers was married off in the old club. And the officers go from ensign all the way up to the admiral, which was great. They'd come back and made rank. And, I really appreciate and enjoyed that.
I was married at the Naval Station at the chapel across the way 18 years ago. My daughter Jenny was married here 4 years ago. We looked at a variety of sites, and this was not one she would have chosen until I convinced her she needed to come and look at it. And it was beautiful. Green plants were lush. We had a balloon arch. Afterwards, we went into the building right behind you, and that was in a room that I remember as a youngster, and that was either having a meeting in that room or a dance. Many, many changes, but wonderful memories, wonderful memories.
For those working at the Long Beach Naval Shipyard in 1949, however, the carefree times would soon end. A significant problem with land subsidence, along with post-war budgetary cutbacks, forced the closure of the base. One month after the shipyard was closed, the Korean War broke out, and the naval force reduction plans were reassessed. On January 5, 1951, the Navy decided to reopen the facility, and 1 month later, operations resumed. The pace of these operations quickly exceeded those of World War II.
During the buildup for the Korean War, you had a pretty active, because they were not only overhauling ships here, but you were loading out ships here carrying material over to those areas.
In the first 2 years after reopening, the shipyard's 8,500 civilian workers serviced 684 ships. By the mid-1950s, the shipyard had reestablished itself as a major support facility for the U.S. Pacific Fleet. This included converting, overhauling, and repairing ships of all sizes. By this time, the largest aircraft carriers had grown to dimensions that nearly filled even the enormous Morel dock. Bob Zimmerman, a worker at the yard, provides an insight into the scale and intensity of this work.
Well, first of all, an aircraft carrier would, depending on whether it was bow in or bow out, would stretch from about 2 feet from that caisson to probably a foot or two of the north end of the dock. It would literally fill the dry dock, and you remember we were talking earlier about the overhang of the carrier. You'd have to use the exterior tracks because the overhang of the ship from the flight deck, you could not get a crane down the inside tracks around the dry dock.
Despite the challenges posed by working on an aircraft carrier, many dock workers felt that their biggest problems were presented by battleships.
I think the battleship's probably the toughest hull to work on, and that's because it had so much armor plate on it. I mean, in the major portion of the ship, there's something like, I don't know, 12 up to 12 inches, and the superstructure up to 22 inches of steel. That's the thickness of the hull in major places. That stuff was tough to work on.
We never built a ship from the keel up here, but we did some pretty amazing overhauls. You'd be surprised how much we used to cut away from ships and refurbish, modernize, and upgrade.
During the 1950s, the Navy did some refurbishment of their own, undertaking several construction projects to correct the subsidence problem. Finally, in 1960, the trouble was conclusively linked to the pumping of oil and natural gas in the area. A program of water injection was begun, and this stopped the subsidence. Congress appropriated $5.5 million for repairs on the base, including raising the deck on Pier 2, building a retaining wall around Pier 1, and raising the walls of Dry Dock 2. But not all the personnel at the facilities were involved in making repairs. During the 1960s, the naval station was home port to 112 ships. Among them were the nuclear-powered guided missile cruiser Long Beach and the nuclear-powered guided missile frigates Bainbridge and Truxtun. 4 anti-submarine warfare aircraft carriers, the Yorktown, Hornet, Kearsarge, and Bennington, were also based in Long Beach, as were 3 squadrons of the Pacific Mine Force minesweepers. One of the sailors aboard these minesweepers was named Floyd Farrar, who gives us a unique look at one of the less inviting features of the base, its brig.
In 1960, this was my home for a little while. In April of 1960, myself and a number of other people on the ship we were apprehended with falsified identification cards. Now, it wasn't anything major. What we did is we were able to up them to make it look like we were 21. We all wanted to go to the hot spots over in Long Beach, the dance halls, the bars, and all this other stuff. And when we were caught, we were court-martialed. We had the lowest court-martial you could get. I think it was called a summary court-martial. But they said we were still bad guys, and this is where I spent the majority of 10 days. I was able to get out because I had a critical rate, they called an electrician's rate, to get back to my ship because the ship was going overseas, and the captain requested me back. But other than that, we would have stayed here. It was quite an experience, and I'm glad I don't have to go through it again. I learned a lot of lessons on that trip.
During the war in Vietnam, in the mid to late 60s, activity at the base and shipyard grew once again. In 1968, the shipyard celebrated its 25th anniversary. At this time, its 8,400 civilian employees serviced about 200 ships per year.
We had almost 9,000 people working here, probably 3 ships going during the Vietnam era. And in addition to the ships that we'd be working in the shipyard, the naval station, which is adjacent to us, probably had 100 ships home ported there. Not all were there at the same time, but we'd have crews. I can remember going out and working on various, and my original background is electronics, working on various communications or radar systems on ships at the naval station as well.
Just as it was after World War II, the end of the Vietnam conflict saw a rise in activity at Long Beach.
After the Vietnam War, the club did more business, the base did more business because the ships were in with more officers and sailors on the base.
But the rise in activity was only temporary. During the post-Vietnam years, Congress voted to reduce the Navy, and the Pacific Fleet left Long Beach once and for all. During the same period, the naval station was changed to a naval support facility. Yet life on the base still went on.
Walking around the base, you get a feeling it being like a campus because we had a gymnasium right behind the club, great basketball court. We had next to that a bowling alley and connected to the enlisted men clubs. And we had a library, we had exchange on the base, an Olympic-sized swimming pool. And they had actually everything there on the base. You know, the sailors didn't have to go off the base. Everything was already there.
When the fleet was reinforced once again during the Reagan administration in the 1980s, the naval station was recommissioned and an expanded battleship surface action group was home ported in Long Beach. 2 of these vessels were also refitted in the shipyard.
Well, the battleship Missouri was in Tokyo Harbor for the Japanese surrender in World War II. That was BB-63. That was home ported here. We refurbished and overhauled the ship and put it back into service. The same with the USS New Jersey, BB-62, possibly a little less well known, but nevertheless same class ship and very powerful as well.
Both of these ships served in the Persian Gulf during Operation Desert Storm, as did many other vessels from Long Beach.
In Desert Storm, the base, they played a big role. A lot of the fleet left out from Long Beach. The club itself played a big role for the families, supporting the families as the officers were leaving while they were gone. We had recreation on the base. We have child care. All these things was there to support the families during the time when the officers was out at sea.
For the Long Beach Naval Station and Shipyard, however, Desert Storm was to be the final chapter in their half-century-long story of service to their nation. With the end of the Cold War in the early 1990s, large cuts in the defense budget were made across the board, and Long Beach was once again targeted for closure.
Are the key facilities that are being closed. In the current base closure, package that was approved by the Base Closing Commission.
This time, nothing could save it. In October 1994, the naval station was closed. The remaining ships that were home ported there were dispersed to other bases. The naval personnel transferred, and the civilian employees shifted to the authority of the shipyard. In September 1997, the shipyard also met the same fate.
As far as I'm concerned, it was a good place to work. I started here as a helper electrician, which is about the lowest job you can get, and worked my way up to production resource officer, which is the highest job you can get. And all that was possible through working here.
I had my ID renewed 2 days before the base actually closed down. And I remember going up, and there was a lot of hustle bustle, scurrying around, carrying boxes and files, and they were really cleaning house to lock the door, and which is exactly what happened. But it's has a lot of memories, and all of them good, all of them good.
The closure of the Long Beach Naval Station and Shipyard was a time of great sadness and loss. But their memory will live on, not only in the minds and hearts of those who served and worked there, but also in the legacy of peace and flourishing trade with the Far East that the bases helped to secure. We should never forget and take pains to preserve the rich heritage of these exceptional places. Hopefully, in their new incarnation, however, they will continue to live on, making tomorrow's history as surely as they have made today's, and touching the lives of generations yet unborn.